So we're going to look at, so this session is what I call plan to plan, all right? So in amongst the things that you've got, for this session, in your bag of tricks, you have a flowchart, which will come up on the screen in a moment. Don't try and read it. But you also have a plan template, and that plan template has some guiding instructions in it. All right, so it's kind of helpful hints on how you might complete the plan. But that's about where I go. Please don't just fill in the plan, because the planning is more important than the plan. All right? You have to do a lot of planning before you can start filling in the plan, which is particularly important because a lot of people tend to want to just fill in the plan. So push the button and it works. So no great surprises. And I should say up front, for some of you, this plan might turn into your preparedness plan. If that's what you want to call it, I'm comfortable with it. Remember though, you're trying to address, mitigate the risks, prevent the risks, not just prepare for the next response. Okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. And the plan will develop or evolve over time. So you don't have to fill it all out in one go, and you might put a bit in here and a bit in there, and it will just keep filling out. And sometimes you might actually get some things done before the plan is finished, which is a good thing. Does that make sense? All right, I was going to ask if anyone here has ever built a house. So typically you have a beautiful plan, but when they start building the house, it doesn't match the plan. So you need to have site variations. Okay, based on what I said this morning, what's this plan going to address? Resilience, help a community to cope, build infrastructure, social infrastructure, all right, economic and also natural environment. And interestingly, in some of those case studies, did we not see each of those? I loved that one that had the economic impact, all right, pop up out of it. So really important. And the World Bank for the 2015 smoke haze from Indonesia ranked that smoke haze as amongst the worst economic impact on the globe. So pretty big deal about doing it in terms of rolling it along. I just want to echo what I've just said is when you're filling this plan out, it's not linear. You don't start and just go through. When you see the flowchart, you'll see there's a lot of backwards and forwards arrows. All right? You don't just rattle on down it. So it's important to understand that. Just echoing here where I said it might be a preparedness plan, I'd be happy with it to start with, but I'd like to think as you mature, you might call it your risk reduction plan, all right? And the word contingency plan in there becomes part of the documentation for preparedness plan. Remember I said this morning, probably 5 elements of good preparedness, and one of them was documentation. That's where your contingency plan goes. I won't be dealing with contingency plans this week. There's just a limit to what I can fit in. But if you look at one of the references you'll have is the Statement of the Apes, chapter that I wrote, 6 in volume 5, Disasters and Ape Conservation. In there, there's some links and some references to contingency plans from around the world. All right, so some quite good ones. And some of them I included just because they were a little bit novel. So the one about legal aspects was included just because no one else considered legal as part of their contingency plan in terms of doing that. And you'll see right at the bottom, and again, some of those case studies emphasise the importance of collaborators. I don't care what you call them, but you need to get everyone that's involved potentially in what's going to impact several of the case studies talked about how important the local community was, whether it was the fruit and veggie market, you know, those things, the interconnection. So you need that collaboration, you need those partners. A number of the fire case studies, as you would expect, we're talking about other partners. So you can't just, excuse me, develop this plan in isolation from those people. Does that make sense? So do that. Nice little quote at the bottom here. A problem anticipated is a problem solved. That was given to me by a military major whose job was to defuse terrorist bombs. So for the Sydney Olympics, he climbed along the top of a train to get to a bomb to be able to defuse it. I reckon that's a pretty good reminder that if you're going to do a plan, that should identify all the problems so your plan can come off on them. So nice little hint there, and your plan ought to address those. So flowchart, pale yellow arrows. You have this for real in your bag of tricks, all right? Did this have a pointer on it? Yes, it does. Top button or bottom button? Top button. It just can't point at both at the same time. So these theoretically are all the steps. Governance, all right, context, we're going to work through these each a little bit. Risk assessment, and you'll notice pre-treatment and post-treatment, and that's just to align with the terminology that we'll be doing on Wednesday. Then you get to your plan, you can see it sitting in the middle here. Community engagement, exercising, and look, there's monitoring and reviewing again down the bottom. All right, so I just want to point out, is that my pointer or your pointer? Doing a good job. So you'll see here these pale anemic yellow arrows are double-ended. So it doesn't just go down here, it goes back there. Similarly here, if you apply a risk treatment, it's going to go back up there. Down here, if you run an exercise, the learning is going to go back to the plan, isn't it? Can you see that? So this is just a reminder that there's a lot of toing and froing on it. Similarly, community engagement is going to have a two-ended arrow. You need to listen to the community and pick up on what they're saying. Looks really easy on the flowchart, doesn't it? So if you want to put this in perspective, when you're in a response, theoretically, this is what you are doing almost from up there down to there every day. You're revisiting that every day in your response plan, all right? So this side's actually a little easier to read than the other side. So does that make sense? So the preparedness plan, while I hover over it, the structure that's in the template that I've given you is a pretty standard across certainly the Western world, but more than that. Of situation, mission, execution, administration, command and control, and safety. All right, and the other thing that that's used for is for briefings. So if you're going to brief a team of people, you've got 5 to 7 minutes, you'll follow the same recipe. All right, so I'm just saying it's a pretty standard template, and we'll have a look at each of those little bits. So this is governance. Does anyone in the room get excited about this? My guess is not. But there is a reason that the UN have got it right at the top of their list, all right? It is important that you have really good governance for your risk mitigation. You've got to have a team that reflects your community, all right? Not just a narrow bit. Remember I said this morning, a governance group doesn't normally include people that do things on the ground or do preparedness work. These are the board of directors. Does that make sense? I think was it the flood rescue that had a chief executive officer and a president was mentioned in their governance group? Was that right, or have I not quite nailed that? But anyway, it's important. You have to have this set up first, and you only need to mention it in your plan that it's set up. The other thing is they'll have to set up all the policies, all the framework that go with it, so that it ensures there is transparency, there is fairness. All right, in terms of doing that. Legal frameworks, goes without saying, in terms of putting it in there. Chances are they'll have everything to do with finance, and usually they influence the timeline because it's linked to finance. So what's the life of your plan? You've got 2 years, 3 years. I think moving animals started at 6 months and finished up at 18 months. So most projects around this, 2 to 3 years is the kind of max, because if you go longer than that, it's going to be hard to see you getting a return. Does that mix with people? And the other reason for documenting it is, over the life of the plan, you're going to have people come and go. So if you've got to document it in the plan, it's much easier to get transition between people as they move along, all right, to do that. Governance. The good thing is that you'll hardly see it between now and the end of the workshop. All right. I know a lot of people. And in the references that I've given you, there are actually a couple of business governance references. And why did I include them? Because they're written in plain English. Only a couple of pages, not pages and pages and pages of stuff. All right. Nice and simple, straightforward. Context. So heads up for this one, because the first thing you'll do on Wednesday morning is actually write the context for your risk assessment. All right, and the case studies have given us some really nice descriptions of context. What's the facility look like? Where's it located? What's that potential harm? What else am I looking for? Vulnerability. All right, so a number of those groups, and certainly we saw after the accident had happened, so after the flood or the fire, they did a little more work and found out the exposure and the vulnerability of the facility. Does that make sense? So you'll be having a bit of a look at that. So you need to get your head around it. What are the hazard or hazards? Can you get that from anywhere? In fact, Indonesia has some really great information online about the distribution of your hazards across your 17,000 islands. All right, so it's quite handy that you can look that up. You've already had someone today show you the maps that you can do for inundation, for floods and flash floods. So a lot of that information is available and it is accessible. And I cannot remember who said it, but get local knowledge. Ask the locals what they know. Historically, they'll tell you that the fire went up there and down there. And that's a really good starting point. So you want to get it from them. So you're going to document that and build it in. I've got their uncertainties. What do you think that's about? How much of this disaster management game is about uncertainties? Do you think you have perfect information? No, you're going to have to make decisions in the absence of perfect information. That's just the reality of it. And if any of you are really interested in it, there's actually a science now called decision science. Been around for a few years, got a couple of journals. Really impressive if you have a passion for that in terms of understanding it. And the last comment there is, so on Wednesday afternoon, you'll apply some risk treatments. And if they're going really well, do you think your context will change? That was the floor, not me. My bones are old, but they don't creak that much. So what I'm getting at is, if you do, as we saw with a couple of the case studies, move or be in an area that's not flood prone or less fire prone, your context must change, mustn't it? Because you've changed the exposure to the hazard. Make sense? So you'll have to go back and revisit the context in terms of doing that. So the good news is that when you write it for the risk assessment, you can almost do a cut and paste into your plan. Does that make sense? And why do you need it in your plan? so that anyone picks up that plan when they read the context, that's their starting point, isn't it? Don't they know the understanding of what you all think is at risk? What's the understanding? So you need to describe that, right? Need to have it in there in terms of doing it. And that'll include any history, either recent or distant. What sort of losses have you sustained? People kind of want to know. It's not going again. Oh, did it go too many? Context, risk. So, first up, while you're looking at the nice pretty table, Steve and I managed to get on the same page. So the risk assessment matrices that you're going to use are the same ones that are being used for the wildlife health risk. All right, so when you're looking at the tables, they're not different, they're all the same. So have you been off in that space? So this is the first of the hard yards. Little prompt in the corner here, remember these environments. You need to think about, I think that's a risk, it's a nail. So you're thinking about the risks to one or more of those. We're only going to focus on a qualitative approach, but you've seen some quantitative approaches today where they were able to analyse the information and pick it up and collect it. All right, to do that. You're going to have single risk statements or definitions. All right, so typically a risk has two bits to it. So you can say lack of clean water supply, and I go, that's good, but it's only half the story. What's the consequence of not having clean water supply? That's the second part of the risk. Can you see that? Lack of clean water supply to ensure healthy orangutans. I don't mind, but your risk statement or your definition will have two pieces to it, and that'll make it a lot easier for you to find your treatments. All right, make sense? So in terms of rolling through, and then you get to do the risk assessment, the old story of consequence versus likelihood. Can't imagine anyone in the room hasn't done this before. My advice is, for most of you, you may finish up having an argument about whether it's there or there. What's the advice? You always go up, not down. All right? So if you think it's there or there, you're going to put it there. Because in a group of 6 people, I'll guarantee you won't all agree. But what I'm saying is it doesn't really matter. If you have some in the group that think it's negligible and others think it's very high, what do you think might be the problem? The risk is probably not being well described, or the context is not understood. All right? Typically, people are going to be pretty close in terms of doing it. The other thing is, you can see here, it says you assess these independently. So you look at the likelihood and forget about any consequence at all. So what is the likelihood in the absence of consequence? And then you do the reverse. What's the consequence in absence of likelihood? You can't do them together. All right? They have to be looked at completely separately. They will come together when you do the actual rating. All right? When you plot them against this table, that's when you bring them together. But initially, you look at them separately. So at the bottom of that, you've got the P-style M. Political, economic, environmental, social, technical, operational, legal, and media and cons. So interestingly, the first time I met Steve was a 20-minute presentation at a World Disease Association conference in Bali, and everyone else was talking about diseases and pathology, and I was the sole person talking for 20 minutes about emergency response and how you can do it in a structured, systematic way, and that's the P-style M. And as I said today, they're all different forms of the same thing, but the key thing is, even with the case studies we've already heard, can see that risks can apply to each of those. All right? And if you start thinking about them in those categories, because what do you think the acronym does for you? Is it not going to make sure that you actually think of each one? Rather than, I'll guarantee if you don't do it, push the pointer. No, didn't work. If you don't, now went forwards, and I wasn't even pushing the forward button. If you don't do it, you'll almost certainly do technical and operational. All right, operational risks are the easy ones. Don't have enough people in the right place at the right time, health and safety. Social's quite hard, and social includes death. All right, so it's a little bit more difficult to pick up. Environment is exactly as you said it. The space that you work in is the natural environment, all right, in terms of rolling them along. So, and we mentioned this morning, media and comms is a massive risk with social media these days. So all of those things are going to give you risk. And I suspect if I asked most of you in the room whether you would pick a risk from any of those, most of you would not have thought that you get a risk out of really important people in life having an influence on what you do, but they're outside your sphere of influence, but you need to influence them. So risk treatment, and again, this is, past experience tells me it doesn't come easy. People want to jump in and find a solution, all right? Whereas what we'd like you to do is pick the risk treatment right at the top of the list that's going to have the biggest impact. Does that make sense? So pull it down. How far up can you go? Because you want to pull a risk rating down. If it's in the red, in that other diagram back here, what have you got to do? You've got to get it back to the yellow or the green. Theoretically, you shouldn't go ahead unless you can get it back into the yellow or the green. All right, so you're going to look for risk treatment to pull it down. We heard in case studies today, most people lost electricity, didn't they? That's a pretty significant risk in this day and age, even just for comms. So can you eliminate that risk completely? All right, and I suspect some people in the room, so the example we had was temporary solar panels on a battery, I think, wasn't it? Someone did that. But there's a whole range of ways of getting electricity, and I wouldn't be opting for the petrol-powered pump engine to run a generator, because then you have to get the fuel for it. But what I'm getting at is, if you look at the little green table, I'm suggesting that you're probably going to be in substitution. So can you get a better methodology that's going to supply you with reliable power to run your fridges and your devices? They're the key things you want to run, aren't they? All right, you're not going to be able to run your 3-phase water pumps off a battery because you won't generate enough power for it. Okay? So, work from the top down. Isolation is usually a barrier. So you're either putting something up a screen or a levy or something like that, all right, in terms of putting it through. So that one often is kind of a last resort. Substitution is usually pretty common. And again, we mentioned this morning, most of you will set out to reduce the likelihood, and that's fair enough, because that's usually about as much as you can do. Can you reduce the consequence? You're probably going to be in elimination. So move people or animals out of harm's way before the hazard impact occurs. Make sense? All right. Accept and manage the risk. And I've got to say that some of the case studies were saying, yep, we've just got what we've got and we're going to deal with it. And that was great. I loved the fact that they took on the challenge and they were going to pick it up in terms of doing it. So I could ask you, most of the people in the room would have heard of the hierarchy of control before, wouldn't you? Yes, no. I know when I went to the conference in Bali, there was a couple of people there that were all about the hierarchy of control. So it's just an example of a tool that you've got, but it's pretty handy. But most of us start down here somewhere, whereas what we want you to do is start up here. And this is harder. I accept that. This is a lot easier. Write a few procedures, but how much do they reduce your risk? How much are they going to bring it down? So after you've written your risk and you've done your risk assessment and it's come out as I put it in pretty simple terms, green, yellow or red, all right, and you've applied a risk treatment, all right, and you're thinking you're going to apply a risk treatment, you need to find out whether there's good support for the risk treatment. So find out whether the community and even the governance group is on board. You know, are they going to support it, not support it? Run an exercise if you need to, see whether it's going to work or not, do some modelling, all right, in terms of trying to pick that up. So pretty important in terms of doing that, and hence this relationship, risk rating there, risk up here, treatment, it'll go round and round until you finish up with a really neat tool. If you're focused on response, you're going to have one of those, one or more, typically more, of the 5 elements of good preparedness. So, for example, documentation, you need documentation for capacity and capability because you want to train people in how to do things. Make sense? So you can't do it. We had a number of examples given of systems that are in there. So they all hook together, all right, in terms of trying to pick them up. So you will find that your treatments overlap in terms of doing that. So you've identified, you've got the risk, you've done the likelihood consequence, and you've now got a treatment. If you go to the E for execution in your plan, that's where these all go. But when the treatment goes in, you have to add who is responsible for it, all right, when it's going to be done, and if necessary, where, all right? It shouldn't be how. So there'll be what I call the W's, who, what, where, and when. And that'll go, so in the template, it actually says that, and it does give the headings of the 5 elements of preparedness. It's pretty cool. All right, so it sits in that. So whatever you put in your risk assessment tables on Wednesday and Thursday, you can carry forward into your execution part of your plan. They're your treatments. All right? And the good news is that I'll be most surprised if a lot of the treatments from one hazard don't transfer to someone else's hazard. They're often the very same treatment. And you saw some great examples today in the case studies of treatments. So, quick, brief rundown of the plan, and just before I do that, because people are probably looking at the picture, today you've had a couple of mentions of incident management team or incident control systems. They're called all sorts of things, but they're fundamentally the same. And they, in a true tree, they look a bit like this: incident controller, comms, planning, operations, logistics. These days there's usually another one called intelligence. All right, intelligence needs to turn information into intelligence so that planning can do something with it, whereas intelligence used to be embedded in planning. So just a little tree, and where would you find this? In your contingency plan. So that when things start off, everyone knows where they are in the tree. Does that make sense? So, and as I said earlier, I know a number of the countries here that use slightly different names, but fundamentally the same heading. All right, so we've got ourselves down to execution. Administration, not quite as uninteresting as governance, but vital. So administration can include who has authority to approve money. Where do the records go? All those things that you need to keep All right, and so these are the instructions to the people that are going to be implementing the plan, the administrative requirements. Do I need to say more than that? I think I could, but I'm seeing a few glazed looks because I know it's pretty uninteresting. When you get to the last C in SMEAC, which is loosely referred to as command and control, that's basically who is in one of those key roles in the structure. So in my language, who has authority to do what? All right, and I'll just take a little pause here. I've explained it to a couple of people today. There is some interchangeability between command, control, and coordination. In fact, they're completely different. So command is at the lowest level. So those fire teams that were in the field would have a field commander. All right, and there was a great example of where they said they got authority for those people to do things without referring it upwards. So that's your field commander. Then the next level up is control. So they bring the commanders together at the scene of the incident. All right, so that's control. Coordination is at whatever you want to call it, district, regional level, and their job is to support control to deliver what the commanders need. Yes? Just a little terminology again that'll help it gel. So command and control, comms and community engagement. So some of you, and when I was asked to do this week, I thought you'd had enough of me by Friday, so you got two of your own talking about comms and community engagement later in the week. But one of the things that communications back is important is this can tell you how people can talk to each other. So whether it's phone, radio, so you can see what the communications network is. Does that make sense? And if you're working with emergency services agencies, chances are they'll have a communications plan that will tell you what channels, what frequencies are being used to talk. So you might actually find that pretty useful. So there was a couple of examples of fires. I think the terminology was two base camps with 2 fire crews. How do they talk to each other? What are the allocated channels? Can you see where I'm coming from? Pretty handy to have documented at the operational level. And community engagement, I'm not going to say any more than that. You just have to make sure you take the time and the effort to get those people. We had plenty of examples of where the community stood up to support you. We had examples of where staff weren't available because they were flooded. So you have to work out how to support them to address some of those risks, not just your risks, because your risks are not getting the people or the food or the like that you've got. And then you need the monitoring and the review. And my advice is that someone has this job. It's their job. In old language, it would have been called an auditor, but it's kind of frowned upon these days. But you need someone that's monitoring how the plan's going. Is it delivering? So who doing what, where and when in the execution, the person monitoring needs to see whether that is occurring. And it's a really good use for AI. All right, can produce really nice reports to tell you what's not being done or what should have been done in terms of picking it up. Now, the monitoring is one thing. The next thing is review. So typically you need a review report. And if I was in the governance board of management, I'd want a report at quarterly intervals, would be nice. So that's what you do the review for. And the bottom line might be project online on time. Make sense? So, and if I'm part of the management team delivering it, I want to know how we're going with progress as well. And again, we saw the horizontal table where someone was reporting weekly by the fires, I think it was. across there. In my world, that would be called a situation report. And again, right across the uniformed emergency management world, abbreviated to SITREPs, and they have a standard format. Might be a good idea for you guys to work up a SITREP format. You're going to have to report on the same sorts of things. So SITREPs are generally pretty straightforward. What's happened, what's been done, what will be done, in a simple language. So community engagement, and if you're wondering what this picture is, this is part of Darwin, when we basically had to search and destroy for every banana plant in the city of Darwin. So we had 69,000 properties to find bananas on, and as you can see there, every property that's got a red roof had a banana plant. Now my point is, if the community's not on board, what do you reckon the chances of success are? So when I started out, the approach was, we're here from the government and you're going to tell us, I'm going to tell you what to do. When I turned up, the first thing I did was got on the radio on a Saturday morning and said, if you want to take your banana plant out, go right ahead, just take a picture, give me a lat long and you can email it into us. Good news was it only cost me $5 instead of $15. All right, but a third of the plants were taken out by the community. What was the single biggest outcome? They owned it. It was theirs. It was no longer ours. It was a big change and we had to work really hard to get that change, all right, in terms of shifting it around. And that image was part of trying to show the public what we were doing, being transparent and open, all right? So even in your preparedness, your mitigation, your risk reduction, and again, Darwin has inundation maps. If I was buying a house in Darwin, that's the first thing I'd look at, not where crocodiles are or aren't. But it's really important to get a buy-in with the community and make sure that it's two-way. Don't just play lip service to the community for the sake of talking to them, all right? They need to know that you're hearing them. And my advice to that is that if you get them on side, they'll back you to the hilt, all right? So in horse flu, we used to have community meetings. They were pretty bloody hostile, I've got to say. But we went to one night and there weren't that many people at it. There were about 40 or so. And they wanted to be in a red zone, not a purple zone. And anyway, a guy in a pinstripe suit had tried to rip into us. And the first person that stood up was a lady in her 60s and she dressed him down and told him to sit down and shut up. So I didn't have to say that, she said it for him. And then he was going to get in the queue at the end, and a 16-year-old young bloke in flip-flops and a pair of board shorts and a singlet t-shirt walked up to this guy, flicked him around on the shoulder and said, listen mate, you've set a really bad example in here for the young people, and just dressed him down. I didn't have to do it, the community did it for me. So if you can get them on side, all right, they'll be a real winner for you. And they'll come up with solutions that you don't expect. All right, really, really valuable in terms of doing it. Cultural needs, I mentioned that earlier today when we were talking about Ebola. All right, you need to understand what the cultural needs of the community are. They're really vital in terms of trying to do that. And I guess the really important thing is if you do get them on side, they're going to do more than you would have ever thought possible. So you won't have to work out how to get fruit and vegetables in a response. They'll know it and they'll bring it to you. Can you see the difference once you get them on side? All right, monitoring and review. I've got the audits there. Aim and objectives. Are they still relevant? Have they changed? All right, pretty important part of understanding the business in terms of what you're doing. Has the context changed? We've talked about that. All right, is there support for the program or has it waned? So my reminder to all of you in the room is that if you have, and I guess you guys, some of you have said the right thing, that it's ongoing, But in my lifetime, what I've learned is that once you get 5 years away from a significant disaster or impact, people have kind of forgotten. So you have to strike while the iron's hot. If you want more money, you want more support, go when it's fresh in people's minds. All right? Once you get to 7 years, you can forget it. People have forgotten about it. All right? They're ready to move on. So Joe would have had that experience in Victoria 3 or 4 times over, even though they had major fires in terms of moving along. Got a little feedback loop there just to make sure that you're going back to see whether you're doing what you said you were going to do. All right? And there's a little reminder here that don't wait till it's finished, because if you review when you think you've finished the program, I'll guarantee you'll find things that you should have done, all right, in terms of trying to put it in there. Okay, and that's the reference. Look at that, I beat the timekeeper again. All right, look, I realise that's a pretty quick rundown. I said you should appoint someone to manage monitoring and review. The other thing I'd suggest is you get someone who's a project manager to keep this thing moving along. All right, someone that organises the meetings, someone that says, where are you up to with this treatment? Why is it not being done? Can you see where I'm coming from? Now, you might have someone in your team already that looks a bit like that, all right? A business development officer, says he. Unlikely. But can you see where I'm coming from? You need someone to own it. Because if you don't have someone own it, it'll stagnate. It'll need to roll along. Okay? Where's my hostess with the mostest?
Okay, thank you, Kevin, for the last session. So, still have some time for questions? Yeah. Okay, so if we still have some time, so if there's a question for Kevin,
one for each hand.
Thank you.
For each hand.
Yeah, I should have got it myself. Sorry if I make people come to me. My question is, speaking very closely to this infection machine, it's actually more for the audience. One of the things that Kevin was talking about with community engagement, how you engage with the community has a lot of cultural and political and social implications. I'm quite sure if a person from the Ministry of Forestry turned up at a facility in board shorts and flip-flops, that you may treat them with a little bit less respect than otherwise. So through the rest of this week, but maybe if anybody's willing to say now, if you have any experience on how you can get the community on your side in this sort of situation, just in a few sentences, can anybody share with that without resorting maybe to flip-flops and board shorts? Or violence?
While you're thinking about it, my way of doing it over the years is to find what I call the unelected community spokesperson. So I suss them out, all the people in the field. Usually they'd be the most unassuming person. So in one of my earlier responses, a lady wouldn't mind me calling her by name, is Margaret Pontifex. I got to know her so well that she confided in me that she had breast cancer. She was in her late 60s, and every community meeting we held, she ran. She stood up the front. It was their meeting because she was running it. All right, so it's really important. That was a tool that I learned early on. Find that unelected community spokesperson. It might be more than one, could be two. And part of that is to stand beside people, not in front of people or above people. Your approach is to always, I'm with you, all right, rather than I'm in charge of you. So I've given you time to think about it. Anyone else want to volunteer? We do have a session on this later in the week, so you've got plenty of time to think about it. But it is vitally important. And at the moment, so what Joe didn't tell you was in 2019-20, we had a flood of veterinarians from overseas to come and work with the affected wildlife during the fires. And part of that problem was a lot of them weren't registered in Australia. They just rocked up. So they're actually unofficially working. They were not a veterinarian. So it became quite a challenge, whereas there was a formal way of getting them into the country. But why have I said that? Because there's an interest holder group, see, I changed the word, that you might even have on your radar, but you want to work out how to engage with them. All right, we had the IFAW talking about what they do today. They might turn up in your backyard, so do you need to engage with them beforehand? That would be much better, all right? So that they're part of what you're thinking, what might happen, what might do. Now, it's only a low likelihood they might be involved and a low consequence, so you don't want to put a lot of time into it. Do you see where I'm coming from? Whereas if you thought it was a high likelihood they're going to be needed, all right, well, you'd put a bit more time and effort into getting them on board. Can you see what I'm doing there? If it's a low risk, you're going to have enough to do with the yellow and the red ones. The green ones, I'm happy to leave them where they are at the moment, because you're all time poor, all right? And how do you make time for this is the challenge, all right? Once you start looking at the risk treatments, you'll finish up with a list a mile long, all right? How many of you saw all the risks out of those case studies? We've already talked about clean water, electricity, all right? Transport, no roads, right? They're all very predictable risks for a disaster. Shelter is another one. Food came up, all right? So it's not only for your animals, it's for your people. Slight mention of, how do I put it? Pharmaceuticals, things that you need for your animals. You know, if you can't get food or water in, what's the chances of having enough of those things? Shelter came up. What I'm getting at is, and you'll hear me very quickly on Thursday in half an hour, go through all those priorities that are risks that you're going to have to address. Right? And at the moment, some of them mightn't be big on your radar, and particularly if you've got a different hazard in terms of trying to roll through it. How are people feeling? Not overwhelming. Look, it is about just being structured and systematic and give yourself time to work through it. As I said, don't try and do this in 12 months. All right? When I was in a paid job with biosecurity, I got audited every 18 months. And you know what the first thing the auditor asked for? Where's your risk assessment? What are the risks that you're going to address? That's what they wanted to know. That was the auditor. And then they'd say, now convince us that you can actually do those risks. So can you kill 2 million commercial chickens in 7 working days? All right, that was one of our risks. That's what we're expected to do. All right, you just think about how hard that is. 25,000 birds in each shed. All right, so can you kind of start to see where we're coming from? Not sure. It's the end of the day.